So today's video is going to focus on what those structures of the brain that you identified already, what exactly it is that they do. So we're going to give some brief overviews, some brief discussion of those structures that hopefully you already have named. Okay, so you can take these notes directly on the diagrams that you already drew on. You can make another copy of the diagrams, whatever works for you. You can just write them in your notebook. Again, like I said, whatever will work for you. Okay, so we're going to start with gyrus-sulcus fissure, really just making sure we understand what those are compared to one another, right? So the gyrus is any of those bumps that are there. So any of these bumps that you see, what look like worms on the brain, okay, that's going to be the gyrus, where the sulcus is going to be these little indentions separating them. Okay, so those little spaces separating them. And then a fissure, really your only difference with a fissure is a really deep sulcus. Okay, so again, a fissure is a very deep sulcus. Like for instance, the longitudinal fissure, that's going to separate the right and left halves of the cerebrum. So if we're segue into that one real quick. So what we're looking at here is a left side of the brain, right? This is the front. Hopefully you've already oriented yourself that way. And this is the back, so the anterior and posterior. And so the longitudinal fissure would be right here, right? It's going to divide. It's going to go right there, and it's going to go down and divide the right and the left side of the brain. So for instance, if we were looking at a view from the top, right? And so there would be the front of our brain, and there would be the front of the brain. And the longitudinal fissure would be right there. So this is the top view. Here's the front of the brain. Here's the back of the brain. The longitudinal fissure is this space between the right and the left sides of the brain. So the longitudinal fissure separates the right and left cerebrum. Okay, so that longitudinal fissure is separating the right and left cerebrum, and down at the bottom of it, it contains what is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum connects the right and left side of your brain to one another. You're talking about like the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, okay? But those two cerebral hemispheres talk to each other through this corpus callosum, which is down at the very base of the longitudinal fissure. Okay, so our next one on our list there is the central sulcus. Hopefully you labeled this. Do be sure you labeled this appropriately. It's this one right here. Okay, it's not that one. That is incorrect. Okay, so there's the central sulcus. The central sulcus is going to divide the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So it will act as a little barrier between those two lobes, so frontal and parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus is right here. Again, hopefully we already labeled this. The lateral sulcus is dividing, if we look at our lobes here, right? It's dividing the frontal and the parietal from the temporal lobe. So it's not dividing frontal and parietal. It's not separating those two. It's separating the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobe there. Okay, so let's make sure we've got all our lobes taken care of appropriately. Okay, so just confirming that we have our lobes done appropriately. So here's our frontal lobe here. The parietal lobe is all of this back here. Remember, the central sulcus is right here. Okay, so the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe is the one out here on the sides by your temple. You'll notice these are they're the same as your bones, right? Parietal bones are on top of your head, frontal bones on the front of your head, temporal on the side. Okay, and then the occipital lobe is the one back here at the back. And so we're not really going to talk about each individual lobe because we're going to talk about parts within the lobe and what those particular parts do. So looking at these various cortex and areas, so starting with the frontal lobe, we have the primary cortex, which is this one right here, right? So that's our primary motor cortex. It's also sometimes called the prefrontal, precentral, I don't know what's wrong with me, precentral gyrus, because it's a gyrus right in front of that central sulcus. So the primary motor cortex, or primary motor area, prefrontal gyrus, that's basically all your motor function has to go through that gyrus at some point in time. Okay? So all your motor function is going to, at some point in time, come from here. Whether it's going to originate from there, it needs to pass through there, but it's, like its name says, it controls all your motor function. Also in the frontal lobe, we have what's called Broca's area. It's about here. Okay, so Broca's area is our motor for speech area. And again, it's only the motor part for speech. So it's the physical movements that allow us to do speech. Okay, so as you're noticing a theme here, the frontal lobe in general is going to be where kind of all of our motor function comes from. It's also where we help process things like consequences and decisions. That all comes from the motor. That all comes from that frontal lobe there, our ability to think a few steps ahead, lay out consequences for our choices, for our decisions. That all comes from that frontal lobe. So Broca's area is our motor for speech, primary motor cortex, and then those consequences and decisions. Okay, looking in the parietal lobe, let me clean this up just a little bit. We have our primary somatosensory, which is going to be right here. And this one is also has another name. So this one is also sometimes called the post-central gyrus. And similar to the motor cortex, this is where all your sensory information comes through. So on either side of the central sulcus here, you've got all your motor information flowing through and the vast majority of your sensory information flowing through. We also have kind of around the base here, we have our gustatory area. Gustatory is taste. So this is the area that's going to help you process various tastes, okay, in your brain. In addition to the gustatory area, we have in the parietal, a little bit in the temporal occipital area, you have that area there that's kind of bean-shaped, that's outlined there. That's called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's is going to be this is where we process speech and language interpretation. So if you remember, Broca's area in the frontal lobe is what physically allows you to speak, allows your lips and tongue to physically form the words. Wernicke's allows you to understand what's being said and allows you to form sentences in your brain that are coherent. So for instance, you could have somebody that damages their Broca's area and they can understand what you tell them. They can, they can understand the language that you're speaking to them, and they can formulate a thought or an answer or return sentence in their head, but they can't physically say it. Or you could have somebody that damages Wernicke's area, and while they can physically speak and they can say lots of words, those words may be gibberish because they're struggling a little bit with their ability to process the language. Okay, down in the occipital lobe, down here in kind of the base of the occipital lobe, we have the visual cortex, and that does exactly what it says. Okay, it processes your vision back there. Okay, and then in the temporal lobe, right about here, these are all kind of rough, right about there, there's your auditory cortex. Auditory is hearing, so this is where the information will come from your ears and it will come to this area of your brain to get processed. And then lastly, also in the temporal area, we have the olfactory area. Olfactory is smell. So again, the information from your nose is going to head to that olfactory area and get processed there. The last part we have here is the cerebellum. And what the cerebellum main function is going to be balance and coordination. So making sure you have nice smooth movements, keeping your balance so you're not wobbly when you walk, that kind of thing. That is all going to be based out of the cerebellum. It's going to be your balance and coordination. This view of the brain here is, we're looking at this is a right cerebral hemisphere, and you're looking at the inside of it. And so this right here is the base of that longitudinal fissure. If you remember, what we find down there is the corpus callosum. So that's that base there that connects those right and left cerebral hemispheres to one another. Okay, there's plenty of things we can see. A gyrus again here. We can see a sulcus. We can see frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. We can see cerebellum again, but we're not going to go through all of those again. Okay, we're going to focus on the new things. So we're looking at this area right in here, which is called the diencephalon. So this kind of middle area right here, that's our diencephalon. And so the structures in that diencephalon area include thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and let's look at what those do. Okay, so our first one here is the thalamus. The thalamus is this like blue one here. That's the thalamus. You have a right and a left thalamus, and these basically act like grand central station for your brain. Almost everything comes up. So this is your brainstem down at the bottom here, connected to your spinal cord. So everything's coming up from your body. It goes into that thalamus, and then from that thalamus, it sends it where it needs to go. Okay, so all that information comes in. The information comes in from your eyeballs, right? Your eyeballs would be ready for awesome drawings. Your eyeballs would be out here, right? In front of your brain. So information comes in, goes to the thalamus. Thalamus says, oh, that needs to come back here, right? So the thalamus is a big relay station. It also works the other direction, right? That motor information comes down from the primary motor cortex. Not sensory information. Motor information is coming down. Motor information from Broca's area. And then it says, go out to the mouth, go down to the spinal cord. Okay, so that's kind of the main job there of that thalamus, is to act as this big relay station, making sure the information goes to the right places so it can get interpreted and processed correctly. Okay, from that thalamus, we've got a hypothalamus. Okay, so hypo means below. So this hypothalamus is below the thalamus. So it is this area right here. That's our hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is going to be attached here to our pituitary gland. And these two work a lot together. So we're going to talk about what they do at the same time. The hypothalamus plays a big role in our homeostasis. Hypothalamus is where we are going to help measure and regulate things like body temperature, our everyday activities, like energy maintenance, whether I need to eat, whether I need to drink. It helps monitor our stress. So it's helping a lot with our homeostasis there. Again, those internal balances. So again, helping regulate with eating, drinking, stress, body temp. All of those are managed there by the hypothalamus. That hypothalamus is, as you can see, connected here to this pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland releases a huge, wide variety of hormones that really help kind of maintain the homeostasis that the hypothalamus is monitoring. It tells your thyroid to release, thyroid hormones. It releases hormones that help monitor blood levels. It releases reproductive hormones. Okay, so the hypothalamus and the pituitary kind of both work hand in hand to help basically control the body's homeostasis, the body's mechanisms, okay, by regulating the release of monitoring these different levels within the body and then regulating these different hormones to help kind of balance it all out. Okay, our next thing here is the epithalamus. And the epithalamus is this kind of back area here. Okay, and so the epithalamus will contain the pineal gland. Okay, and the pineal gland is going to help regulate our sleep-wake cycles. And that's going to be located at the back here behind the thalamus. Okay, as we move down into the brain stem, let me clean this up again a little bit. So the brain stem contains three parts, midbrain, pons, and then the medulla oblongata. So we're going to start up top with the midbrain. So this kind of area here is the midbrain. And our focus in the midbrain is going to be on coordinating some motor functions, in particular motor functions associated with vision information and auditory information. If we look on the back here, you'll see these little bumps here on the back. Those are, and both of them are part of it, those are called the corpora quadra. Quad means four. You have two on the right, two on the left. Quadragemina. Right, and the corpora quadragemina, what these will do is this is where visual and auditory reflexes will come from. That automatic blinking when something gets in your eye, the flinch or turning to look when you hear a loud noise. Those are considered auditory and visual reflexes, and those are processed there in that midbrain, in particular in that corpora quadragemina. This large bump here, that's going to be our pons. And then the bottom part here is going to be the medulla oblongata. The pons, similar to the thalamus, because of its location, holds a wide variety of tracks or pathways for the brain and the spinal cord to communicate with one another. And so it will result in kind of a wide variety of functions from sleep to breathing. And the one we're going to focus on is the fact that it does help monitor and help kind of even out your respiratory rhythms so that you have nice, even, controlled, smooth breathing. The medulla, located directly below it, is going to help with other autonomic functions like cardiac centers, so for helping to measure, helping monitor blood pressure, help monitoring heart rate. It will help with the respiratory rhythm with the pons. Vomiting comes from here. So a lot of autonomic things that we don't really think about, the medulla and the pons will help us control. Again, things like blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rhythms, vomiting. All of these things are, are monitored through the medulla, because through the medulla and the pons, there's a lot of our cranial nerves, which we'll talk about. They come from this area and they help with those things. So those are all of our brain structures that we are going to be responsible for. Okay, so your responsibility involving these brain structures is going to be able to identify them as well as know what they do. So locate them and then what they do. So we'll practice some in class with this. We'll do our dissection to help with this, and we'll do some practice worksheets to help with